a Charlie Parker, que nos va a compartir un resumen del escenario financiero, las fuentes y los tipos de fondos que hay para REDD. Charlie es el director ejecutivo del Climate Focus y de verdad que le queremos agradecer ahí que haya aceptado la invitación para compartirnos esta importante fuente de información. Creo que está siendo requerida por los procesos REDD en los países. Entonces dejo con ustedes a Charlie Parker.
Sorry, I just used my headphones. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I'm going to go straight from that very detailed view of REDD legal systems that was just given to the other end of the 30,000-foot view. So I hope I don't spin your minds too much in the process. Can everyone hear me okay? Maybe just lift the mic up a bit, Charlie. Just blanket around. Is that better? So I'm going to give an overview of the main sources of REDD finance and the magnitude of REDD finance. I'll talk a bit about the role of public finance, and then a little about the role of private finance, and then offer some of my conclusions. So I'm really grateful for that last comment about this broad church view of REDD+. I certainly agree with that, and one thing that I heard a way back was thinking about REDD as an outcome and thinking about REDD as a mechanism. And in the context of this discussion, I'm definitely going to be talking about REDD+ as an outcome. So how do we think of the multiple ways that you can achieve reductions in emissions from deforestation and forest degradation? And we know that there are many activities and many sources of finance that can achieve that outcome. And this broad definition of REDD+ can help us to understand the multiple activities that achieve reductions in emissions and addressing the drivers of deforestation. So bear with me if you think some of what I talk about doesn't fall into your traditional view of REDD finance. So having said that, I'll divide my presentation into public and private sector. Under the private sector on the left-hand side, what we often think of as private sector is carbon markets. So I classify this first group of mechanisms that we'll discuss and sources of REDD finance as direct markets, things that are directly paying for some REDD outcome. And that can include carbon markets. It also includes payments for watershed services, biodiversity offsets. But essentially, someone's exchanging finance for an asset under that situation. Another source of REDD finance are other markets. We know that commodities drive deforestation, but at the same time, sustainable supply chains can have the reverse effect. So there's a big source of finance that can be tapped into these larger markets to achieve REDD outcomes. On the public sector side, there are two main sources of public sector finance that I want to talk to you about. The first is what I've called an earmarked budget, the type of budget that doesn't change with political will. I'll give some examples, but here's PES mechanisms, carbon taxes. And then there are those other budgetary sources. Domestically, that's just a budget line, and that can change with a new incoming president or political leader. And on the international side, there's ODA. So what does that world of finance look like under those four buckets? From our calculations, there's $15 billion. This is an annual figure of REDD finance. You'll see that at the bottom, the main sources of REDD finance are public. Over 90% of REDD finance is from public sources. Even more overwhelmingly, over 2/3 is domestic, this big chunk. The 1% is voluntary carbon markets. And the other 7%, around $1 billion, comes from supply chains. I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail. So on the public finance side of things, 90%, $14 billion every year, comes from either domestic or international aid. And as I've said, it's something that has to compete with other sources of public money that we know and we've heard about is scant resources. So is it going to go towards forests, or will it go towards health, or will it go towards biodiversity, or will it go towards education? Public finance is in limited supply. The main source of public finance is domestic. I've shown 4 key programs here. Brazil, this is self-reported finance, $500 million. I'll tell you what it's for. Mexico has a pro-arbol program that they've self-reported, $500 million to plant 250 million trees. China has a grain to green program that's $7 billion domestically every year to replant along the Yangtze and avoid soil erosion. So there's this huge source of finance that we hardly ever talk about that's there, that's being supported by red countries, essentially. One thing that's worth noting is that our data on this and our understanding of how much countries are spending already is really limited. So an example of Latin American, Brazil's ABC program. Essentially, Brazil has developed a low agricultural carbon program. They have a credit line, a federal credit line that farmers can access that is around 5% concessional loans. It's about 0.5% below what you get in a bank for farmers to undertake certain types of activities. They have strict environmental provisions. When it first was launched, there was hardly any uptake. None of the finance was dispersed in the first year. And then, the government realized that there was not enough concessionality in the finance, it wasn't at a low enough rate, and that people didn't know about it. So they started marketing it, and they took out some of the more stricter environmental caveats. And they spent around $2 billion by April 2013. As you can see, that would blow out of the water any money that they would have received through other sources. International red finance is what we often think of as the holy grail of red finance. I have some disappointing news on international red finance. So we can see where it's going. On the left-hand side, $2 billion to Latin America, 2.2 to Asia and the Pacific. Sorry, 2 to Asia and the Pacific, 2.2 to Latin America, which is the largest source. But these are just pledges. So $6.5 billion have been pledged. And this was up to 2014, so 2008 to 2014, these figures. If you look at disbursements, it's a very different picture. So here are the main multilateral funds and the main bilateral funds. As you can see, the big purple bars indicate how much has been pledged. If you add all those together, you get to that $6 billion number. The red is how much has been deposited into those funds, so governments have gotten rid of the money, donor governments. But if you look at the disbursement figures, if you add all those up, it's just 480 million, and that's over a 5-year period, which stacks up to less than $100 million a year. And that's over all of the 40-odd red countries. So although it's a large source of pledged finance, we know that there's big difficulties in getting it through multilaterals, big difficulties in going through implementing agencies, and then big difficulties getting it out the door from governments. So overall, although it seems like it's the source of finance we should all be focusing on, it actually has very low rates of disbursement. Another snapshot of bilateral finance in the countries where bilateral finance is being delivered. And again, focusing on disbursements, on the left, Norway, you can see that the lion's share of Norwegian finance has gone to Brazil. They've received 400 million of that. Germany, through its Red Early Movers program, has been investing in countries. Japan, through its ODA climate finance program, the same. And those are the finances for how much each of those have delivered, roughly $600 million since their inception. So, thinking about that broad church of REDD finance, if we think of other sources of international finance, here are 4 other funds, none of which you would think of as REDD funds. PPCR is the People's Program for Climate Resilience, one of the climate investment funds focusing on adaptation. LDCF is the Least Developed Countries Fund, again, an adaptation fund. The adaptation fund is clearly for adaptation, and the SREP is the Small Scale Renewable Energy Program. These figures are not how much those funds have to deliver, these figures are how much they are delivering to forest-related projects. So we shouldn't think of, even in terms of international sources of finance, of just the usual suspects, the FCPF, the FIP, the Carbon Fund. There are other sources of finance that aren't really tied into our REDD narrative that nonetheless have REDD outcomes. A couple of examples. This is the PPCR, the People's Program for Climate Resilience, and a project in Mozambique that is essentially trying to understand the resilience of different types of plantation species with a view to having them being more drought tolerant. But it will achieve huge REDD outcomes because it will plant large areas of Mozambique with forests. Another one, slightly more tangential, but nonetheless a REDD project in my